All right, guys. Today we are going to be reacting to Germany open its door to million refugees. Here's how society changed. Thank you so much for the support, guys. I just saw this video, just wanted to jump in and react to it and see what you guys think about this. Make sure you guys like to subscribe. Let's just jump in.
Nearly 10 years ago, Angela Merkel's government opened the doors to asylum seekers fleeing wars in the Middle East. What followed was an influx unlike anything seen for a generation. Roughly 1 million Syrians came to Germany, along with hundreds of thousands of Afghans and Iraqis. While migrant numbers in 2015 and 2016 were high across the whole of Europe, nowhere was as accepting as Germany, a sentiment summed up by Merkel's cry of,
Wir schaffen das.
or we can do this. Well, 10 years on, and the jury's still out on whether the country handled it or not. In the workforce, in crime statistics, in economic growth, in politics, everywhere you look, the impact of that momentous decision is still visible, like ripples on a pond spreading slowly outward to touch every corner of society. So, now seems like as good a time as any to look back over those 10 years and take stock, to try and investigate all the ways this unprecedented influx changed Germany for better or for worse.
Interesting topic.
In terms of sheer numbers, it's almost impossible to get your head around the scope of the migrant crisis that Europe faced between 2015 and 2016. Over those 2 fateful years, 2.3 million asylum seekers arrived on the continent's shores. Some came via dangerous boat crossings, accompanied by mass drownings and tragedy. Others made their way overland through the Balkans, winding up on the borders of nations like Hungary. Although there were some from nations such as Eritrea or Kosovo or the Gambia, the vast majority were fleeing wars in the Middle East, the insurgency in Afghanistan, the sectarian strife in Iraq, and most of all, the devastating civil war in Syria. In 2015 alone, Eurostat records that almost 360,000 Syrians applied for asylum in the EU. Of these, roughly 320,000 did so in Germany. Now, the reasons why Germany became such a magnet for arrivals are paradoxically both simple and complex. Simple because the direct cause was Chancellor Angela Merkel keeping the borders open to refugees coming over land. And complex because the trigger for this open invitation were European asylum rules. Under the Dublin regulation, asylum requests were supposed to be processed in the first country of arrival. So, if you were fleeing Syria and headed for the Balkans, you should be processed in Greece or in Bulgaria. Equally, if you were coming by sea from North Africa, you'd likely be processed in Italy. In 2015, though, the system broke down. So many migrants were streaming in that Greece in particular was in danger of being overloaded. With a humanitarian crisis brewing on the EU's borders, Germany suspended the Dublin regulation for Syrians. Shortly after, Merkel decided to also welcome those travelling overland via the Balkan route rather than insist they be processed in Hungary. And so began one of Europe's greatest recent population movements. Here are some basic facts. In 2015 alone, Germany received 441,805 asylum applications, including the roughly 320,000 Syrians we already mentioned. In 2016, the overall number of applications from all countries jumped to an eye-watering 722,270. By way of comparison, neighbouring Poland received just 12,000 applications. Now, to be clear, these numbers are just for applications, many of which were refused. The 1,500 a day who arrived from Kosovo, for example, were judged to be economic migrants and sent back, as were the almost 30,000 who arrived from Albania and the nearly 20,000 from Serbia. But still, a vast number of the arrivals were allowed to stay. As the academic book Framing Refugees writes, by the end of 2022, Germany had granted protection to almost 1 million refugees and asylum seekers from the main countries of origin, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. End quote. Now, of course, this wasn't the end of the migrant influx into Germany. As the war in Ukraine heated up, another 1.2 million refugees arrived from the east. At the same time, another 250,000 Syrians arrived between 2022 and 2024. Overall, Germany is now thought to house
1.5 million.
one-third of all Europe's asylum seekers. Were it not for the enormous Ukrainian refugee populations in nations like Poland, Germany's share would be even higher. For certain nationalities, the numbers are even more lopsided. Eurostat records that nearly 52% of all Syrian asylum seekers and over 47% of all Afghans in the whole of Europe today reside in Germany. It's not for nothing that the Wall Street Journal has written that Germany's migrant inflow is the largest of any nation outside the USA. Obviously, there's a great big caveat to discussing migration in Germany, which is the role of the EU. As you probably know, any EU citizen can move to any other part of the EU. Prior to Brexit, I could have rocked up anywhere from Portugal to Malta to Latvia, no questions asked. And Germany is a particularly attractive destination for its opportunities, if not its weather. In 2023 alone, over 581,000 EU citizens moved to the land of bratwurst and sauerkraut. This compares to around 329,000 asylum seekers. And we mention this because discussions of migration, and Germany, especially those by non-Europeans, sometimes fail to distinguish between EU migration, skilled third country migration, and asylum seekers.
Yeah, in the way to think about this, the way is much easier for me to understand this. It's basically the EU is basically the federal government. It's basically the federal government, and then those countries that are inside the federal government, which means the EU, are basically the states. Right? And the states are pretty much very autonomous on how they handle certain things. If you're not part of that European Union, of course, you're not part of that confederacy. That's how I understand it.
And
I might be wrong. Let me know in the comment section below.
Scarier than they are. When you hear that 14 million people, or about 16% of the German population, are foreigners, for example, it can be tempting to believe they're all new arrivals from the Middle East. But according to official statistics, over 5.1 million are from other EU states, mostly Romania, Poland, and Italy, while another 1.5 million are part of the country's long-standing Turkish minority, a minority that traces its history all the way back to 1961. Even when looking at those from the big three refugee nations, Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan, outlets don't always distinguish between asylum seekers and all the rest. So, for example, the overall number of Afghans in Germany hovers around 420,000, but only 322,000 of those are classed as asylum seekers. Still, however you cut it, it's fair to say that the refugee population is not small. Roughly 3.5 million refugees live in Germany as of 2025, and it's the makeup of these 3.5 million, along with where they are clustered, that have driven so many of the changes over the last 10 years.
Yeah, shout out to this guy's voice, man.
Information from the Federal Statistical Office.
Yo, this dude's voice is like, they going, that 10 years. Jeez, shout out to him, man.
Says there were around 973,000 Syrians in Germany at the end of 2023. It both tells us a lot, but also not very much. Sure, you can use these figures to demonstrate that Syrians are now Germany's third biggest minority after Turks and Ukrainians. Or you can dig down a little deeper and note that 712,000 of them hold refugee status, or that around 200,000 of them are children enrolled in German schools. But this doesn't tell us who these people actually are. Who are the nearly 1 million Syrians who arrived in Germany starting in 2015? Where do they live? What do they do? And what sort of backgrounds do they have? Thankfully, we already have the answers. German network DW informs us that the vast majority of Syrian arrivals live in just 3 of Germany's federal states: Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and North Rhine-Westphalia. If you're struggling to picture where the heck any of these places are, the simple answer is that Bavaria is the home of Munich in the far south, Baden-Württemberg is just next door and centered around the city of Stuttgart, while North Rhine-Westphalia is up on the Dutch and Belgian borders and features the massive urban hub of Cologne, Dortmund, Essen, and Dusseldorf, as well as the old capital of Bonn. This highlights an important fact. Germany's Syrians are almost all clustered in and around large cities, since that is where job opportunities are.
Yep.
It's a similar story
Makes
for
sense.
the nation's 322,000 or so Afghan asylum seekers. According to the Statistical Office, the highest proportions are found in Hesse, around Frankfurt, and in Bavaria. The roughly 200,000 Iraqis cluster around the city of Oldenburg in Lower Saxony. Ukrainians, meanwhile, are mostly found on the eastern borders with Poland and the Czech Republic. As to who they are, well, where Syrians and Afghans are concerned, the vast majority are male and young. Among Syrian arrivals between 2015 and 2023, only 41% were female, while the average age was 25. The Afghan population is even more weighted towards men, with only 35% or so being female. This is in massive contrast to the influx of Ukrainians after 2022, the majority of whom were women and children. The website InfoMigrants points out that
Yeah, because the male, they basically stayed to fight. They didn't have any other option, right? So that makes sense. I just sometimes when I'm thinking about asylum seekers, I'm thinking about female, like women and kids, right? But what you see here in the trend is that it's mostly, men. Very young men, like too young. Right? Between 17 to 29 kind of a thing. Like, why is that? I have no idea.
As the route from the Middle East to Germany can be so dangerous, it makes more sense for young men to attempt it and send for their families afterward. And yeah, families. More than 60% of those who applied for asylum in Germany between 2017 and 2023 were married. In some cases, these families fled together. The Yazidis, who were targeted for genocide by ISIS in Syria and Iraq, tended to come all at once. But they count for a mere 1% of refugee totals from those two countries, with Christians an additional 2%. By contrast, some 90% are Muslim. But that doesn't mean they're homogenous. Looking just at Syrians, while
correct.
60% are ethnically Arab, a full third are Kurdish. Nor are education levels the same. In the initial wave of Syrian arrivals from 2015 to 2017, 50% held either a high school diploma or a university degree. But by the next major wave, the number who had finished high school had dropped to merely a third of arrivals. Speaking of Syrians, a good chunk of them are no longer counted in the data as refugees, but rather as German citizens. The Federal Statistical Office reports that 160,000 Syrians now have German passports, with hundreds of thousands more having applied. With the qualifying time for citizenship having dropped from 8 to 5 years, The Economist estimates that as many as 40% of Syrians may have applied. Yet these figures only tell a fraction of the story. After all, this is a video on how these arrivals impacted Germany as a whole. So, it's time to start digging down into the social costs and benefits. Starting with perhaps the biggest area of all, the economy.
I guess
Now, the deeper you get into the fine
I guess bringing more labor force probably helped to the GDP. I would like to know how these communities, right, clash with the German way of life. That's what I want to hear.
details of refugee impacts on German society, the more and more you start to bump up against people spinning the figures to suit a narrative. And not by lying or even massaging the truth, but just by highlighting facts that only tell one side of the story. Take employment, for example. In a major 2024 study, the Institute for Employment Research revealed that, to quote the coverage in Euronews, most refugees who arrived in Germany thanks to Angela Merkel's open door policy have now found work. And this statement is factually correct. Of those who arrived in 2015 and 2016, the employment rate now stands at 64% compared with 77% for the wider German population. It's also true, as The Economist notes, that the employment rate for Syrians in Germany is higher than in most other EU countries.
Okay.
Yet neither of these statements tells the whole story, because frame it another way, as DW does, and you could say with equal accuracy that the unemployment rate for Syrians is 37%. As of 2025, the regular unemployment rate across Germany stands at 3.6%, which is almost 10 times less. That means that according to the most recent data available, there were around 226,600 Syrians working in jobs with social security coverage and another 279,000 or so registered as looking for work. There are also huge variations between men and women. While 73% of Syrian men who arrived in the first migrant wave are now employed, only 29% of women are. One major downside of such high unemployment rates is the sheer size of the benefits bill. Germany is unusually generous, allowing asylum seekers to claim thousands of euros a month while not working. According to Statista, this cost the federal government 29.7 billion euros in 2023. By way of comparison, the entire military budget for 2023 was around 67 billion euros. As the
Wow, that's costing a lot of money. That's costing a lot of money. And hey, I'm not here to say whether this is good or bad, because I really want to hear you guys' opinion. It could be either or, right? But because I don't live in Germany, I have no idea what's going on there. I'm just literally just getting this information.
Wall Street Journal writes, more than 60% of the people in Germany who depend on government benefits for income are foreign-born or are second-generation migrants. End quote. It's not like most people aren't aware of this giant price tag. Engelsberg Ideas writes that, quote, many workers who just about get by on their salaries each month are critical of a system that uses their taxes on welfare while they see infrastructure crumbling around them. Public transport is becoming more unreliable and public services are under strain.
No way.
End quote.
No way.
However, this also is not the full story. And we'll be seeing this a lot over these coming chapters. Shades of nuance and pivots from one point of view to another. So, apologies if you were coming here just to get ammunition to own the libs or grab some little facts to throw back at your MAGA-loving uncle. You're out of luck. I mean, who would have guessed that Real life would turn out to be way more complicated than angry dudes on the internet would have you believe.
Correct.
The added complexity where employment is concerned involves all the barriers Germany puts up to migrants working. Many fleeing the war are initially protected under a temporary stay order. This is until it can be determined if they qualify as refugees. Until their process ends, which can take months or even years, they have only limited access to work. Even after gaining refugee status, though, the system still makes working hard. Here's how the Wall Street Journal describes it. Asylum seekers aren't permitted to work for at least 3 months after arrival. Electricians and mechanics aren't allowed to own their own business or hire employees until they complete a vocational course. Economists and politicians said Germany is slow in recognizing foreign qualifications for doctors and teachers. End quote. So to see what we mean, let's look at the
But I see what you did there. I see what you did there. You just glassed it over. Now, is Germany wrong for doing this? Is Germany wrong by doing this? That's the question. Let me know in the comment section below. That's all I want to hear. Let me know in the comment section. Is Germany wrong for doing, you know what? Hey, you came to this country, but hold up. Let's just check your background. After that, let's just give you some instruction how to do certain things. Let me know in the comment section below.
Rate for Ukrainians across Europe. In the UK, 65% of Ukrainian refugees work and earn enough to support themselves without the need for benefits. In Poland, the number's 61%. In Germany, though, it's a mere 18%. And while it could be that Ukrainians fleeing west thoughtfully divided themselves into lazy and not lazy groups depending on the country they were heading for, it's more likely that this is evidence of a general problem refugees have entering the workforce. This is extra problematic when you remember that Germany has been trying to quietly shore up its shrinking workforce via migration. The European Union's official employment service estimates that the boomer generation retiring will shrink the German workforce by 7 million come 2036, just as the number of people expecting state pensions explodes. In an ideal world, you could offset that shrinking population by letting in an increasing number of migrants. Adding in as few as 288,000 workers a year until 2040 could keep the workforce steady and allow for all those generous pensions to be funded. This is kinda already happening in some places. The German healthcare sector has had a persistent shortage for a while, the impacts of which are being lessened by the roughly 10,000 Syrians working in the system. The state of Thuringia, meanwhile, has been using migrant labor to fill roles in logistics companies that would otherwise stand vacant. Sadly, though, this isn't an ideal world, and that means the impact of over 1 million arrivals hasn't purely been economic. There's also been the social impact. And it's here where things start getting
a little weird.
Really rather controversial.
This is where things get very
As we
weird.
alluded to earlier, the migrant crisis of 2015 was far from the only time that Germany absorbed an insane number of arrivals. In the 1960s, Germany invited in hundreds of thousands of so-called guest workers from Turkey, so many of whom wound up staying that there are now 3 million people of Turkish descent in the country. In the early 90s, around 700,000 refugees from the Balkans arrived, escaping the bloodshed in the former Yugoslavia. But what felt new in 2015 was how visible the arrivals were across the country. Here's Czech weekly magazine Respect, quoting, "Migration, which has long been a feature of Germany's large cities and the industrial Rhineland, is now more visible in smaller towns." Now, we already know that the vast majority of Syrians, Afghans, and Iraqis settled in cities, but that still leaves a sizable minority who wound up in smaller towns. And that has had knock-on effects in places that felt immune to previous migration waves. To quote Respect again, "The large number of newcomers has contributed to higher rents, waiting times for doctors and dentists have increased, and the proportion of children in schools who speak poor German has increased." End quote. These are the things that people take.
There we go. That's one. Yeah, that's one concern that probably the locals are having. Now, again, I don't know how Germans feels about this, right? I have no idea. But we have to really listen to you guys' opinion to see whether or not you guys are okay with this.
Tend to notice not macroeconomic trends, not the positive impact on the job market, and unless they're hospitalized, not the impact on healthcare. And while it's impossible to fully quantify the effect of so many localized issues piling up, public polling suggests that there has been at least some impact. Let's start by looking at public attitudes to refugees. Back in January, the Deutschland Trend survey reported that 68% of Germans want the country to take in fewer refugees, compared to a mere 3% who thought the country should take more. Zoom out to immigration more generally, and the numbers are similarly stark. One poll by ARD found 77% of Germans want a change in immigration policy, while another poll by the insurer R+V reported back that, quoting, 56% said they feared the government was being overwhelmed by immigration. This has gone hand in hand with an increase of fears about public safety. Fears that emerged even before the latest spate of vehicle ramming and knife attacks. In spring of 2024, a Deutschland Trends survey revealed that 40% don't feel safe in public spaces. What's notable in this case is that the number has sharply climbed from 2017, when only 23% recorded feeling unsafe. Other surveys carried out by the police have found a third of people are scared to use public transport after dark. Now, there are many reasons why your perception of safety might change over 6 years, but there are signs that migration is forefront in German minds. A 2024 poll, for example, found that 61% believed, quote, Islam will become too strong in Germany.
Ooh.
A 14% increase from 20.
Damn, that's crazy statement right there. Islam will become too strong in Germany.
2019. As to whether these fears are justified from a public safety standpoint, well, it's a little hard to say. The German press code forbids identifying criminals by their ethnic backgrounds, which can make tracking these things hard. But statistics do differentiate between citizens and non-citizens. Obviously, the second category includes any non-German who lives in the country and commits a crime. Still, it can at least give us a general idea of broader trends. And frankly, they're not great. The Wall Street Journal reports that, quoting here, non-citizens, who make up 15% of the population, perpetrated 41% of all crimes in 2023, up from 28.7% in 2014, according to police statistics. Again, this is all non-citizens, not just refugees and asylum seekers. But we do have access to some data on the latter regarding specific crimes. Someone in the German Federal Law Enforcement Agency leaked an internal report to a Swiss newspaper, which showed asylum seekers had committed nearly 7,000 sexual assaults between 2015 and 2023. In 2021, they made up over 13% of all sexual assault suspects, despite accounting for less than 4% of the population.
That's a
At
lot.
this point, we should probably note that by global standards, Germany still remains an incredibly safe country. Eurostat's homicide statistics show that Germany suffered 0.74 murders per 100,000 in 2022, the most recent year for which there is complete data. For comparison, the Canadian homicide rate that year was 2.27, while the US homicide rate was 7.5.
But the case of Canada in the next 10 years is gonna become a non-white country, majority non-white country. Damn, I don't even know what to say about this, guys. I don't know what to say about this. Of course, I have my own opinions in a lot of these things, right? But when it comes down from my country, United States, I have my own opinions on this. But when it comes down to Germany, a lot of European countries, I want to understand why you guys think the way you think. That's all. Like from the healthcare system, education system, food, culture background, everything. I want to know how you guys think.
And while the German sexual assault rate of 44.61 per 100,000 was much higher than in other EU countries, here in the Czech Republic it stood at just 0.86 in 2022, it was still lower than the rate in Denmark, Finland, France, Norway, Sweden, or Belgium. But still, the public perception is broadly that Germany is becoming increasingly dangerous and that migrants are to blame. In some ways, it's easy to see why. One of the most horrific crimes recently committed in Germany was when an Afghan asylum seeker known as Emamullah O stabbed a toddler to death in Bavaria. Although the murder child was of Moroccan descent, it wasn't so much the attacker's heritage that pissed people off as his background. Since arriving in Germany, Emamullah O had been arrested for assaulting a Ukrainian woman at a refugee hostel, for fighting with police officers, and for exposing himself in public. Yet he remained free to keep on living in Germany. As the Financial Times notes, only a fifth of the 400,000 refugee return decisions made across the EU each year are ever carried out. In Germany, 2024 saw 221,000 asylum seekers ordered to leave, with 80% of them then given tolerated status, meaning they can't legally be removed. Or as Respect put it, when talking about all the refugees who'd recently carried out attacks in Germany, quote, almost all of them also repeatedly broke the law. So far, the changes to German society that we've discussed have been mixed. Some positive contributions to certain sectors of the economy, combined with a large benefits bill. A perception...
Crazy, man. I'm gonna leave it there because this is crazy. I just simply wanna get you guys' opinion on this issue. Again, open book, and I want to hear you guys' opinion. Let me know what you guys think. I want to hear you guys' opinion. See you in the next one.